And Fox Sports' lead game analyst, Joel Klatt, joining us now. Joel, before we look ahead, I want to look back. You were in Ann Arbor on Saturday, and Texas had its way, frankly, with the Wolverines. I think back to a year ago when Texas went to Alabama and they beat the Crimson Tide, and there was a lot of hand-wringing, and Jalen Milroe got benched and all that stuff, and Alabama still made the 4-team playoff. So I don't think losing to Texas is disqualifying for Michigan, certainly not in a 12-team playoff world. But what would Michigan have to do, in your estimation? What would they have to improve on to be a team that's good enough to be there at the end?
Yeah, I think that there's two ways to think about Michigan coming off of that game. You can think to yourself like, hey, you know, this was always going to be difficult. We were trying to replace 18 starters, a head coach, 2 coordinators, and we're facing a great team in Texas that, quite frankly, is right now right at the top of college football. I've got them right there with Ohio State and Georgia in my rankings. So that it was always going to be tough. And then the other, line of thinking is a more concerned line of thinking, like, hey, the depth on the defensive line is not what it used to be. We don't have any identity on the offensive side of the ball and don't seem to have a way out of that if the offensive line doesn't become good right away. The lack of targets on the outside, who's going to be the #1 wide receiver that steps up? That's all concerning. I'm somewhere in the middle. I can see the concern. There's no doubt, but the concern is more about the schedule. And what you saw now has to go face USC. What you saw now has to go face, even though Oregon hasn't looked yet, they got to play Oregon. They got to play Ohio State. Like there's other teams in this Big Ten that are starting to play well. So you can see a world where Michigan is in 1-score games and has a floor of like 7-5. So that's seriously concerning, Rev. And then you've got to talk yourself out of that a little bit and think to yourself, okay, they are replacing 18 starters. They were facing one of the best teams in college football, and they didn't do anything that Michigan normally does. They didn't win the time of possession. They played way too many snaps on defense. They turned the ball over. They lost the field position battle. All of those things were staples for Michigan in their national championship year. In fact, not even just staples as in they were good. They were the best in the country at almost all of those things, and none of them happened against Texas. This team was never going to beat Texas unless the blueprint was followed to a T. It wasn't, and they got beat pretty handily.
I want to ask you about one other game from last week, and I don't want to probe too much on a sensitive subject given the conversation we had last week about your obvious ties to Colorado, but Nebraska kind of manhandled the Buffs, certainly in that second quarter. They manhandled the Buffs. So when you look at Nebraska now, what do you think? Like, has your perception of them, has it been elevated? Like, how good do you think this Husker team can be?
Okay, so let's take this in like a kind of a threefold. And I did this on my show, not with Nebraska, but, what did we think of this team coming into the season? What do we think about them now? And then when will we know for sure? So let's just kind of take it. I thought Nebraska was going to be a team that was going to be drastically improved before the year. Basically because they had to be, based on the turnover numbers. Remember, they lost, what was it? Rev, I think it was 5 one-possession games where they turned the ball over 17 times in those 5 games. 14 of those 17 turnovers were by the quarterback. So if they just got net positive play out of Dylan Raiola, their quarterback, they were going to be a much better team. Turns out they're not getting just net positive play. They're getting really good play out of their quarterback, Dylan Raiola. In fact, if you would listen to Matt Rule during his press conferences, which I do, he says that Dylan's probably the best part of the offense and that everyone needs to keep up with him. I'm sure you've played that soundbite on some of your shows this week. I thought that said a lot about where Nebraska is and where they could go. So what do I think about them now? It's even better than I thought in the preseason. This is an 8 or 9 win team. I would be shocked if they're not playing meaningful, consequential games as it relates to the playoff in November. And when you look at their schedule, they are better than almost everybody until they get to Ohio State. So we're going to know everything we need to know about Nebraska over the course of the next few weeks. If they can handle business and get to Ohio State as an undefeated, I'm going to know that they're for real.
Certainly not out of the realm of possibility when you look at that schedule. And if they play like they did in the first half, going up 28-0, that was about as well as they can play, Joel.
And I would just say, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say that, I played it there twice in that stadium. And, Rev, that atmosphere looked even crazier than I can remember. That's one of the great atmospheres in all of college football, and I actually tweeted this out. Watch out like, if Nebraska ever gets it going, if Matt gets it going, that place is going to be on fire. They are just dying for the Huskers to be good again, and it looks like they finally got it.
Yeah, it's amazing to think that the sellout streak has continued through all of these lean years. It does make you wonder what this is going to look like when they are truly good, and I'm with you. It feels like they're on the verge of it. We'll get a chance to see that atmosphere here on the Big Ten Network Saturday night against Northern Iowa. I want to ask you about your game on Saturday, Wisconsin and Alabama. Badgers have had two closer than expected games, I would say, against Western Michigan and South Dakota. I mean, they were losing to the Broncos in the fourth quarter. They get Alabama, and in fairness, I mean, Alabama's final score looked pretty good on Saturday, but they were in a battle with South Florida as well before they pulled away in the fourth quarter. Still, Alabama, I think people look at this game and think Alabama's the superior team. What would Wisconsin need to do to keep this close and to have a shot at an upset?
Yeah, so one, yeah, I mean, Alabama's roster is better than Wisconsin's roster. We all know that, and that's reflected in what we think of these teams from a rankings perspective. Now, Rev, if you're talking about like a blueprint, for what Wisconsin would need to do, it's really two things. The first thing that they're going to need to do is really lean into this run game, which they by the way, they think is a lot better than a year ago. Last year was the first year, and I hesitate bringing up stats on your air because I'm like, I think Rev already has said these stats probably like 50 times, but last year they ran the ball ran the ball under 50% of the time for the first time since the 40s. Okay, and I'm sure you kind of know that. And I was wondering in the offseason, like, is this going to work? Is this kind of change going to work? Now, they've run it much better and more frequently in the first couple of weeks this year. I know that they trust their offensive line, and the offensive line is going to have to be the best part of Wisconsin on Saturday if they want to beat Alabama, because they have to control the game at the line of scrimmage. They can't allow Jalen Milroe to have more snaps than Tyler Van Dyke. That's just unsustainable. So you've got to control the line of scrimmage. Then when your defense gets on the field, you've got to think about those turnovers. You got Hallman out there. He's got 7 interceptions a year ago. This is a defense that they feel good about. I know that they're going to have, they replaced their linebacker as the senior captain. Tackett Curtis will probably play. He's the transfer from USC. Tackett Curtis is a guy they think highly of. The defense is going to have to take the mistakes that Alabama gives them and capitalize on them. So they're going to have to get turnovers, control the line of scrimmage with their offensive line. If they do those two things, I think it's a close game late.
They'll have their hands full, but I'll tell you what, the anticipation, Wisconsin, we were talking to Hunter Wohler yesterday on the show. He said, I've had this game circled since I was in high school.
I bet. And he's a Wisconsin guy, man. Like, he stayed through this coach. Like, he wants this game more than anything. Didn't Wohlers have like 120 tackles last year?
Yes.
I mean, he might have 120 on Saturday. He's going to be so fired up.
2 weeks in, aside from the teams that we've talked about here off the top, Nebraska, I think, is kind of an obvious one. Who's the Big Ten team that in your mind has been kind of the most pleasant surprise?
Well, there's an obvious one and a less obvious one. I would say the obvious one is USC, and we're all talking about USC, and more specifically D'Anton Lynn and the defense. That's been a pleasant surprise because we haven't seen improved defense from a Lincoln Riley coach team in quite some time. The less obvious one to me is Michigan State with a league win already over Maryland. That's for Jonathan Smith. Like, let's not just throw that out as like, well, that's a good one. That's a giant win to win your first league game. I think that Michigan State would be that one. And I could talk about Indiana. They've been impressive so far under Kirk Cignetti. Let's see, Illinois with the win over Kansas. There have been some teams that I think have played really well, but Michigan State winning against Maryland, I think, was a big one.
Some pretty good stories so far early on this year, and I agree with you, particularly the big plays against that Maryland defense, which has gotten better and better here in recent years. We saw the upside of Aiden Childs for sure on Saturday.
We know Jonathan Smith is a good coach. So it's like when they get these kind of benchmark games like this, Rev, it's like, okay, well, this is going to take a shorter amount of time than we thought for Jonathan Smith to become, competitive in the conference.
A lot of excitement with Spartan fans, a lot of excitement in Madison, too, as we express. Should be an unbelievable scene. Big noon coming your way on Saturday. You and Gus and Jenny, can't wait to hear the call. Have a great time.
Great to talk with you, man, as always.